My name is Eileen Matthews, and at 58 years old, I never thought I'd be fighting for my life inside my own walk-in freezer. My son Jeffrey had always been troubled, but when he locked that heavy door with me inside, something in me changed forever. As I huddled there watching my breath turn to frost, I realized this wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. What he never expected was that I'd not only escape, but I'd be the one to decide his fate. Before I tell you what happened, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into a story of betrayal and unexpected strength. I spent 25 years building a life I was proud of. As a hospital administrator, I worked my way up from an entry-level position to overseeing operations for an entire wing. My colleagues respected me, and I loved the sense of purpose my career gave me. But nothing compared to the joy and pride I felt as a mother to Jeffrey. I raised Jeffrey alone after my husband Paul died in a car accident when our son was just 10 years old. Those early years were incredibly difficult, balancing grief with the responsibility of being both mother and father to a boy who'd just lost his dad. We leaned on each other during that time, forming a bond I thought was unbreakable. "It's just you and me now, kiddo," I'd tell him when times got tough. "We're a team." And for many years we were. I worked extra shifts to ensure he had everything he needed. Good schools, sports equipment, summer camps. I made it to every baseball game and science fair. Despite our loss, I was determined to give Jeffrey a normal, happy childhood. When Jeffrey was 16, I met Richard. He was kind, patient, and genuinely interested in building a relationship with my son. I was cautious at first, worried about disrupting the balance Jeffrey and I had created, but Richard never tried to replace Paul. Instead, he offered friendship and mentorship, helping Jeffrey with homework and teaching him to drive. 2 years after meeting Richard and I married in a small ceremony with Jeffrey as the best man. For a while, we felt like a complete family again. Richard brought stability and warmth back into our home. Jeffrey seemed to accept him, and I dared to believe we'd all found happiness after the tragedy. But looking back, I see the warning signs I missed. During Jeffrey's junior year of high school, his grades began to slip. I found small amounts of money missing from my purse, which Jeffrey always had excuses for. He started staying out past curfew, coming home with bloodshot eyes and the distinct smell of alcohol on his breath. "It's just normal teenage stuff, Eileen," Richard would say. "Don't worry so much." I wanted to believe him, so I did. Jeffrey was bright and charismatic. His teachers always said he had potential. He managed to graduate with decent grades and got accepted to the state university. I was so proud, thinking the rough patch was behind us. I helped him move into his dorm, decorated his room, and left him with tearful hugs and high hopes. 3 months later, the university called. Jeffrey had stopped attending classes. When I finally reached him, he admitted he'd been partying too much and fallen behind. He promised to do better next semester. I believed him. I always believed him. By the end of his freshman year, Jeffrey had been caught with marijuana in his dorm room and was placed on academic probation. Rather than face the consequences, he dropped out and moved back home. That summer was tense. Richard tried to talk to him about responsibility and future plans, but Jeffrey would just roll his eyes and walk away. "He's not my father," he'd mutter under his breath. When we found a small bag of pills in his jacket pocket, I couldn't deny the problem anymore. We convinced Jeffrey to see a counselor who recommended an outpatient treatment program. I paid for it without hesitation, desperate to get my son back on track. This became our pattern for the next decade. Jeffrey would seem to improve, get a job, even maintain relationships. Then something would trigger a slide back into addiction. A breakup, a job loss, or sometimes no reason at all. Each time I'd help him pick up the pieces, pay for another treatment program, let him move back home, just until he got back on his feet. Richard grew increasingly frustrated with the cycle and with my inability to set firm boundaries. "You're enabling him, Eileen," he'd say. "He needs to face consequences." "He's my son," I'd reply, as if that explained everything. By the time Jeffrey turned 32, he'd been through 5 rehabilitation programs, held at least 12 different jobs, and broken countless promises. He'd also become more manipulative, more entitled, and increasingly resentful of me. the very person who continually bailed him out. 6 months ago, Jeffrey lost his apartment after failing to pay rent for 3 months. Despite Richard's objections, I invited him to stay with us again. I told myself it would be different this time. He seemed genuinely remorseful and promised he was finally ready to change. "I've hit rock bottom, Mom," he said with tears in his eyes. "I don't want to live like this anymore." I believed him. I wanted so badly to believe that this time would be different. For the first few weeks, it seemed like maybe it was. Jeffrey was polite to Richard, helped around the house, and even attended a job fair. I started to hope again, despite the wariness in Richard's eyes. Then my grandmother's silver candlesticks disappeared from the dining room hutch. When confronted, Jeffrey denied taking them, suggesting perhaps I had moved them and forgotten. 2 days later, my diamond earrings, a gift from Richard on our 10th anniversary, went missing from my jewelry box. This time when confronted, Jeffrey broke down. He admitted he'd taken the items and sold them to pay off a drug debt. He begged for forgiveness, promising it would never happen again. "I was desperate, Mom. These guys were going to hurt me. I'll make it up to you, I swear." I was heartbroken, but still couldn't turn my back on him. Instead, I made him promise to attend Narcotics Anonymous meetings. He agreed readily, seemingly relieved by my forgiveness. "You've always been my rock, Mom," he said, hugging me tightly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I didn't realize then how manipulative those words were, or how they would come to haunt me in the freezing darkness. The first thing I noticed was my prescription migraine medication disappearing faster than it should have. I take it only when absolutely necessary, yet the bottle emptied within a week of renewal. When I mentioned this to Jeffrey, he looked surprised. "Maybe you've been having more headaches lately, Mom. You have been under a lot of stress." His deflection seemed plausible, but a nagging feeling persisted. I started paying closer attention to other details around the house. Small amounts of cash disappeared from my wallet. The liquor in our cabinet seemed watered down. My credit card statement showed charges I couldn't recall making at gas stations and convenience stores. Even more disturbing were the strangers who began appearing at our house when I was at work. Our neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, called one afternoon to let me know that several rough-looking young men had been coming and going from our house. When I confronted Jeffrey, he claimed they were friends helping him with job leads. "They might look a little sketchy, Mom, but they've got connections. One guy's uncle manages a warehouse and might have an opening." Richard was less easily fooled. One evening he pulled me aside after dinner while Jeffrey was in the shower. "I found a spoon and lighter in the guest bathroom," he whispered. "And there was residue on the counter. You know what that means, Eileen?" I did know, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Not again. "Maybe it's not what you think," I said weakly. Richard shook his head, disappointment evident in his eyes. "How many times are we going to do this?" Jeffrey's behavior became increasingly erratic. Some days he was cheerful and energetic, talking nonstop about future plans and possibilities. Other days he barely left his room, claiming he felt sick or was just tired. He took phone calls in whispers, immediately hanging up if I walked into the room. The tension in our home grew unbearable. Richard and I argued more frequently, always in hushed tones behind closed doors. Jeffrey seemed to enjoy the division he was creating, often playing us against each other. "Richard never liked me anyway," he'd tell me when we were alone. "He's always been waiting for an excuse to get rid of me." The breaking point came when I returned home early from work one day to find our house in disarray. Drawers had been pulled out, couch cushions upturned, and picture frames knocked from the walls. I called the police immediately, terrified we'd been burglarized. Jeffrey arrived home while the officers were taking my statement. He appeared shocked by the scene, but something about his reaction seemed off. He was too calm, asking too many specific questions about what had been taken. The responding officer noticed too. "Sir, where were you today?" he asked Jeffrey. "Job hunting," Jeffrey answered quickly. "I've got callbacks lined up at 3 places." When the officer asked which businesses, Jeffrey became flustered and vague. As the questioning continued, inconsistencies in his story emerged. Finally, When the officer mentioned checking security cameras at neighboring houses, Jeffrey's composure cracked. After the police left, Jeffrey admitted he'd ransacked the house himself, looking for valuables to sell. He claimed a dealer was threatening him over an unpaid debt. The break-in was meant to cover his tracks. "I never meant for you to be scared, Mom. I was going to clean it up before you got home." His confession was accompanied by tears and promises to get help. Despite the magnitude of the betrayal, I found myself considering giving him one more chance. That evening I discovered my grandmother's ruby ring, the most precious family heirloom I owned, was missing from my jewelry box. When confronted, Jeffrey initially denied taking it, then confessed he'd already sold it to a pawn shop across town. By the time Richard and I got there, the ring had been melted down for its gold content. I cried all the way home, mourning both the irreplaceable ring and the trust that had been irrevocably broken. Richard held my hand in silence, knowing no words could ease this particular pain. At home, I finally delivered the ultimatum I should have given years ago. Either you go to rehab, a real inpatient program, or you can't stay here anymore. Jeffrey agreed immediately, seemingly relieved to have a clear directive. The next day, I made calls and found a facility with an opening the following week. Jeffrey appeared genuinely committed, looking up the program online and asking thoughtful questions about the treatment approach. "I know I've said this before," he told me, eyes downcast, "but this time is different. I've never felt this low, and I never want to hurt you again." For a brief period, hope flickered once more. Jeffrey attended NA meetings daily while waiting for his treatment bed. He helped around the house without being asked. He even apologized to Richard for the tension he'd caused. "I know I've been difficult," he told his stepfather during dinner one night. "I appreciate you sticking by Mom through all of this." Richard nodded stiffly, clearly, reserving judgment until he saw lasting change. His skepticism proved warranted. A week later, I discovered Jeffrey had been leaving the house for NA meetings, but never actually attending. Instead, he'd been meeting with the same troubling friends, continuing to use drugs, and searching for other valuables to steal from our home. I found this out because my sister Amanda spotted Jeffrey at a bar when he was supposedly at a meeting. She called me immediately, concerned and confused. "Eileen, I don't want to cause problems, but Jeffrey is definitely not at NA right now. He's with two men I've never seen before, and they look dangerous." That night I went through Jeffrey's room while he was out and found pawn tickets, drug paraphernalia, and receipts showing he'd sold several more of my possessions, including a silver picture frame containing a photo of his father and me on our wedding day. My heart broke all over again, but this time anger overshadowed my sadness. I'd been played for a fool repeatedly, and it was time to stop the cycle. When Jeffrey returned home, I confronted him with the evidence. Instead of the usual remorse, his face hardened with resentment. "You went through my things. What happened to privacy and trust?" he snapped. "You forfeited that right when you lied to me, again." The argument escalated quickly. For the first time, Jeffrey didn't try to charm or manipulate his way out of the situation. Instead, he revealed a bitterness I hadn't realized he harbored. "You think you're so perfect, don't you, Saint Eileen, the martyr mom? You love having me dependent on you. It makes you feel important." His words stung precisely because they contained a kernel of truth. Had I been enabling him partially to fulfill my own need to be needed? The thought was uncomfortable but worth examining later. For now, I stood firm. "I want you to leave. Tomorrow. I'll help you find a place to stay, but you can't live here anymore." That night, I cried myself to sleep, grieving for the son I thought I'd raised and the relationship I'd thought we had. Richard held me close but said nothing. We both knew this turning point was long overdue. The next morning I awoke to the sound of raised voices. Richard and Jeffrey were arguing in the kitchen, their words sharp and hostile. I rushed downstairs to find them standing on opposite sides of the room, Richard's face red with anger, Jeffrey's twisted in contempt. "Tell her," Richard demanded when he saw me. "Tell your mother what you said." Jeffrey rolled his eyes. "Richard thinks I threatened him. He's being dramatic." "You told me to watch my back," Richard said, "after you asked about our life insurance policies." My blood ran cold. "Jeffrey, what's going on?" Instead of answering, Jeffrey stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Richard and I stood in stunned silence until he finally spoke. "Eileen, I can't do this anymore. I love you, but I can't live with him." "He'll be gone tomorrow," I assured him. Richard shook his head sadly. "We've been here before. You'll find a reason to let him stay, to give him one more chance." He paused, looking pained. "I need some space. I'm going to stay with my brother for a while." I tried to argue, to promise things would be different, but the resignation in Richard's eyes told me he'd made up his mind. Within an hour, he had packed a suitcase and was heading out the door. "Please don't go," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I have to," he said gently. "For both our sakes. I love you, Eileen, but I can't watch you destroy yourself for someone who doesn't want help." He kissed my forehead. "Call me when he's really gone." After Richard left, the house felt eerily quiet. When Jeffrey returned that evening, he seemed almost pleased to find Richard gone. "It's better this way, Mom," he said, putting an arm around my shoulders. He never understood our bond. I pulled away, disturbed by his casual dismissal of my marriage. "This isn't better, Jeffrey. I love Richard, and he left because of your behavior." Jeffrey's expression darkened. "So it's all my fault, nice mom. Really supportive." Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense. Jeffrey made no move to look for alternative housing, despite my daily reminders that he needed to leave. Instead, he became more controlling, suggesting I was too upset to be alone and needed him to stay. "Richard abandoned you," he'd say. "I'm the only one who really cares about you." I found myself avoiding friends' calls, partly from shame about my situation, and partly because Jeffrey would hover nearby, listening to my conversations. When my sister invited me to lunch, Jeffrey claimed to feel ill and asked me to stay home and care for him. "You've always been there for me when I needed you," he said pitifully. "I need you now." The manipulation was obvious, but extricating myself proved difficult. Jeffrey had inserted himself into every aspect of my daily routine. He'd offer to drive me to work, claiming my car needed maintenance. He'd volunteer to pick up groceries, but forget items I specifically requested. He started answering my phone when friends called, telling them I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. Gradually, I began to feel not just emotionally manipulated, but physically unsafe in my own home. I noticed kitchen knives disappearing from the block, only to reappear days later in strange places, under couch cushions or in bathroom cabinets. The deadbolt on the back door was mysteriously damaged. My sleeping pills went missing, then returned to a different shelf in my medicine cabinet. When I mentioned these oddities to Jeffrey, he suggested I was becoming forgetful or paranoid. "Maybe you need to see a doctor, Mom. This doesn't seem normal." One night, I woke at 3 a.m. to find Jeffrey standing in my bedroom doorway, just watching me sleep. When I startled, he claimed he'd heard a noise and was checking on me, but the blank expression on his face haunted me for days afterward. That weekend, when Jeffrey left to meet a friend, I secretly called Richard. "I'm afraid," I admitted, my voice shaking. "Something's wrong with Jeffrey. Something worse than before." Richard listened as I detailed the concerning behaviors. "This sounds dangerous, Eileen. You need to get out of there." "I can't just leave my own home," I protested. "Then he needs to go. Today. Call the police if necessary." I promised to handle it, though I wasn't entirely sure how. When Jeffrey returned, I steeled myself for the difficult conversation ahead. But before I could speak, he surprised me with an unexpected change in demeanor. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. "You're right. I need to get my life together. Let me make dinner tonight, a proper meal like we used to have. We can talk about my plans for moving out." The sudden shift made me suspicious, but I also desperately wanted to believe he was sincere. I agreed cautiously, watching as he busied himself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and marinating chicken with surprising skill. "We'll need a few things from the freezer," he said casually, referring to the walk-in freezer in our garage, a relic from my brief foray into catering years ago. "Can you help me find the frozen artichoke hearts?" I nodded, following him into the garage, still wary but hopeful that perhaps we were turning a corner. As we entered the large freezer together, Jeffrey chatted animatedly about dinner plans and his ideas for finding an apartment. Then, as I bent down to look through a lower shelf, he asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Mom, I've been meaning to ask, am I still the beneficiary on your life insurance policy? The one from the hospital?" I straightened up slowly, a chill that had nothing to do with the freezer's temperature running down my spine. "Why would you ask that?" His expression remained neutral, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Just planning for the future. You're not getting any younger, you know." In that moment, I knew with terrible clarity that I was in danger. I took a step toward the door, but Jeffrey moved faster, blocking my path. "Jeffrey, let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "In a minute, Mom. First, let's talk about how you've been threatening to kick me out of my own home." I tried to push past him, but he shoved me backward, sending me stumbling against the metal shelving. Before I could regain my balance, Jeffrey stepped outside and slammed the heavy freezer door shut. I heard the distinctive click of the lock engaging, followed by his voice muffled but audible through the door. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll tell them I found you too late. A tragic accident. You must have gotten confused and locked yourself in." The freezer's temperature was set to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Within minutes, my fingers began to tingle painfully from the cold. I pounded on the metal door, screaming Jeffrey's name, begging him to reconsider. The only response was the sound of the garage door opening and closing as he left. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. The freezer was well insulated. No one would hear me scream. My cell phone was in the kitchen. Richard was miles away. The cleaning service wouldn't arrive until Monday, 3 days from now. The horrible reality of my situation sank in. My own son had just left me to die. "Think, Eileen?" I whispered, my breath forming visible clouds in the freezing air. "Think." I forced myself to assess my surroundings methodically. The walk-in freezer was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with metal shelving units lining 3 walls. The shelves held various frozen foods, catering supplies, and some old kitchen equipment I'd stored and forgotten about. The overhead light was controlled by a switch outside, but an emergency light provided dim illumination. My first priority had to be staying warm enough to survive. I was wearing jeans, a light sweater, and slippers, wholly inadequate for extended exposure to freezing temperatures. Hypothermia would set in quickly if I didn't find a way to insulate myself. I searched the shelves and found several large tablecloths from my catering days. I wrapped one around my shoulders like a shawl, and another around my lower body. I put a third cloth over my head, leaving just my face exposed. It wasn't enough, but it would buy me some time. Next, I needed to try to escape. The door was heavy metal with a simple latch mechanism that could be opened from inside, except Jeffrey had somehow jammed it. I examined it closely in the dim light and discovered he'd wedged something into the latch from the outside, preventing it from disengaging. I tried various objects from the shelves to pry the foreign object out. Spatulas, serving spoons, even a wooden rolling pin. Nothing worked. The metal was too cold to touch with bare hands, and my fingers were already becoming clumsy with cold. As the hours passed, my body began to shiver violently. A good sign, I knew from first aid training, as it meant my body was still fighting to maintain its core temperature. When shivering stopped, that's when real danger would begin. To keep my mind functioning, I forced myself to think practically, rather than dwell on Jeffrey's betrayal. I searched the freezer methodically for anything that might help. Behind some frozen meat, I discovered an old catering toolbox I'd forgotten about. Inside were various tools: a screwdriver, pliers, a small hammer. With renewed hope, I returned to the door and began working on the jammed latch, using the tools to try different approaches. My movements were hampered by the cold and the bulky tablecloths, but determination drove me forward. As I worked, memories of Jeffrey as a child flashed through my mind. His gap-toothed smile when he lost his first tooth. The way he'd crawl into my bed after nightmares seeking comfort. His proud face when he hit his first home run, eyes searching the stands to make sure I'd seen. How had that loving boy become the man who could leave me here to die? The temperature seemed to drop further, or perhaps it was my body losing its ability to generate heat. My movement slowed, and I had to fight to stay awake. I knew that if I fell asleep, I might never wake up. I thought of Richard, of the disappointment in his eyes when he left. He'd been right all along. I'd enabled Jeffrey's destructive behavior until it had turned on me. If I survived this, I would make amends. To Richard, to myself, and yes, even to Jeffrey, though not in the way I'd tried before. Time became distorted in the freezing darkness. Had I been here for hours or days, my fingers were numb, making it increasingly difficult to manipulate the tools. My lips felt frozen, and forming words became an effort. But something inside me refused to give up. I remembered something a nurse had once told me during a hospital crisis. The body can withstand incredible hardship if the mind stays determined. I clung to that thought, focusing my fading energy on the door latch. In my exploration of the freezer, I'd found a box of emergency supplies I'd stored during a hurricane warning years ago. Inside were hand warmers, the kind that activate when exposed to air. I tore open several packets, placing them inside my makeshift tablecloth cocoon near major blood vessels at my neck, armpits, and groin. The small amount of heat they generated was like a miracle, giving me a second wind. I returned to the door with renewed determination, this time using a combination of the screwdriver and pliers to work at the jammed mechanism from a different angle. After what seemed like hours of painful, meticulous work, I felt something give. A small piece of metal, a broken key or pick of some kind, fell from the latch. I pressed the handle down, and the door swung open. The warm air of the garage hit my frozen face like a physical blow. I stumbled out, my legs barely supporting me, and collapsed onto the concrete floor. I was alive but far from safe. I knew Jeffrey would return eventually to discover my body, and I needed to act before that happened. Moving was agony. My extremities burned as circulation returned, and every joint screamed in protest. But survival instinct drove me forward, crawling toward the door connecting the garage to the house. I had just reached the door when I heard a car pulling into the driveway. Jeffrey was back. Terror gave me one final surge of adrenaline. I grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench and pulled myself to standing position behind the garage door. When Jeffrey entered, he was whistling, actually whistling, as he walked toward the freezer. He didn't see me until I stepped forward, wrench raised defensively. His face registered shock, then quickly rearranged into concern. "Mom, what happened? Did you get locked in the freezer? My God, you're blue with cold." The performance was almost convincing. If I hadn't heard his earlier words, if I hadn't felt the deliberate push, I might have believed him. Instead, I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. The skilled manipulator who had been playing me for years. "Stay away from me," I managed to say through chattering teeth. "Mom, you're confused from the cold. Let me help you inside." He stepped toward me, and I swung the wrench not to hit him, but to keep him at bay. "Don't touch me. I heard what you said. I know what you did." Something dark flashed across his face. Anger, perhaps, or frustration that his plan had failed. Then he lunged toward me. I swung the wrench again, connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled back, surprised by my resistance. "You've lost your mind," he spat. "Who's going to believe you? A confused old woman who locked herself in a freezer." "The police will," I said, my voice stronger now. "When they find the piece of metal you jammed into the lock. When they see the life insurance policy you took out on me. When they hear the questions you asked about my will." Fear flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to connect these dots. Without another word, he turned and ran from the garage, jumped into his car, and sped away. I collapsed again once he was gone, the wrench clattering to the floor beside me. With trembling hands, I reached for my emergency cell phone in the kitchen drawer and dialed 911. "Please help," I whispered when the operator answered. "My son tried to kill me." The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics found me huddled on the kitchen floor, still wrapped in frozen tablecloths, my core temperature dangerously low. They rushed me to the hospital, where I was treated for moderate hypothermia and early frostbite on my fingers and toes. Richard arrived at the emergency room before I'd even been moved to a regular room, his face ashen with worry. When he saw me connected to warming blankets and IV fluids, he broke down. "I should never have left you alone with him," he said, holding my hand carefully to avoid the affected fingertips. "You were right about him," I admitted through cracked lips. "You were always right." The police came to take my statement while I was still in the emergency department. Despite my physical condition, I insisted on telling them everything immediately. Jeffrey's questions about life insurance, the deliberate way he'd locked me in the words he'd spoken through the door. The detective, a woman named Martinez, listened carefully, taking detailed notes. When I finished, she asked, "Mrs. Matthews, do you want to press charges against your son?" I hesitated, maternal instinct still warring with self-preservation. "He needs help," I said finally. Detective Martinez nodded sympathetically. "Yes, he does. But he also tried to kill you. This goes beyond addiction issues. This was premeditated." "I know," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "But he's still my son." "Take some time to think about it," she advised. "We'll look for him either way. He's a danger to you and potentially others." After she left, Richard sat beside my bed, his expression troubled. "Eileen, I know this is impossible for you, but you need to tell them everything. Jeffrey needs to face consequences." "What if prison makes him worse?" I asked. "What if letting him escape consequences kills you next time?" Richard countered gently. I knew he was right, but I needed time to process the magnitude of what had happened. Not just the freezer incident, but the years of manipulation and escalating behavior that led to it. The next day, still in the hospital, I received a visit from another detective who had been searching Jeffrey's computer from his room in our house. What they found chilled me more than the freezer had. "Mrs. Matthews, your son conducted several searches related to hypothermia, accidental freezer deaths, and life insurance payouts," the detective explained, showing me printouts. "He also created a document that appears to be a script, things to say when he discovered your body." The evidence was undeniable. Jeffrey had meticulously planned my death. Further investigation revealed he had indeed taken out a life insurance policy on me 6 months earlier, forging my signature on the documents. He had also been researching how to access my retirement accounts and the equity in our house. While I was digesting this horrifying information, a nurse came in to tell me I had a phone call. It was Jeffrey. "Mom," he said, his voice tearful, "I don't know what you told the police, but it's not true. I would never hurt you. You know that, right?" Despite everything, a small part of me wanted to believe him. The pull of maternal love was strong even now. But the evidence, the freezing hours, and the look in his eyes when I confronted him told the truth. "Jeffrey, you need help," I said firmly. "Turn yourself in." "They'll lock me up," he protested. "Is that what you want? Your only son in prison?" "What I want is for you to take responsibility for once in your life," I replied, surprising myself with my steadiness. "What I want is for you to get the help you clearly need." "You're choosing Richard over me," he accused. "You always have." "No, Jeffrey. I'm choosing life, mine and ultimately yours too, because this path you're on will destroy you." He hung up without another word. Detective Martinez, who had been recording the call with my permission, nodded approvingly. "That was brave, Mrs. Matthews. We've put a trace on his phone and have officers searching his known locations. We'll find him." 2 days later, I was discharged from the hospital. The doctors assured me there would be no permanent damage from my hypothermia, though some of my fingertips might remain sensitive to cold for months to come. Richard took me home, but not to our house. He had arranged for us to stay in a hotel until we decided what to do long term. I couldn't imagine returning to the house with the freezer where my son had tried to end my life. That evening, Detective Martinez called. They had located and arrested Jeffrey at a bus station attempting to flee the state. He was being held on charges of attempted murder fraud and elder abuse. The prosecutor contacted me the next day to discuss the case. She was straightforward about what lay ahead: a difficult legal process, possible traumatic testimony, and the likelihood of having to face Jeffrey in court. "You'll have input on any plea deals offered," she explained. "Your statement as the victim carries significant weight." I was still processing this when Jeffrey's court-appointed attorney called. His approach was less compassionate. "Mrs. Matthews, I understand this has been difficult, but surely you don't want your son to spend decades in prison," he said smoothly. Perhaps we can work something out. A reduced charge mandatory treatment instead of incarceration. I told him I needed time to consider all options, then hung up and broke down crying in Richard's arms. I don't know what to do, I sobbed. He tried to kill me, but he's still my son. What kind of mother sends her child to prison? What kind of son tries to murder his mother? Richard countered gently. Eileen, loving Jeffrey doesn't mean letting him escape consequences. Real love sometimes means hard choices. As the investigation continued, more disturbing evidence emerged. Jeffrey had previously dated a woman who had suffered a suspicious fall downstairs while he was the beneficiary of her renter's insurance. He had convinced an elderly neighbor to add him to her will shortly before she had an unexplained car accident. Neither case had been prosecuted due to insufficient evidence, but the pattern was clear. My son was more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The decision to face Jeffrey in jail didn't come easily. For days after his arrest, I vacillated between anger, grief, and a persistent, irrational hope that there had been some terrible misunderstanding. But as evidence continued mounting against him, I knew I needed to see him, to look into his eyes and try to understand how we had arrived at this unthinkable place. The visitors' area was stark and institutional. I sat at a small metal table, my hands clasped tightly together to stop their trembling. When Jeffrey was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, my heart contracted painfully. Despite everything, he was still my child. His initial expression was one of relief. Mom, thank God you came. You have to help me get out of here. Hello, Jeffrey, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. How are you? He looked momentarily confused by my calm tone. How am I? I'm in jail for something I didn't do. I studied his face carefully. Jeffrey, they found evidence on your computer. They found the life insurance policy. The emergency key to the freezer was in your pocket when they arrested you. His demeanor shifted, charm replacing indignation. Mom, I can explain everything. The searches were because I was worried about food safety in that old freezer. The insurance was meant to be a surprise for you, extra coverage I was paying for. And the key? Of course I had it. It's my house too. For a moment I almost wanted to believe him. The explanation sounded plausible when delivered with his earnest expression, his eyes wide and sincere. This was the skill that had allowed him to manipulate me for years. Jeffrey, I said softly, please don't lie to me anymore. His facade cracked slightly. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry. Fine. I'm sorry you got out of the freezer before I came back. The coldness in his voice confirmed what I'd already known, but struggled to accept. Why? I asked. I've always tried to help you. Help me, he scoffed. You controlled me, made me dependent on you, then threatened to throw me out when I needed you most. His eyes narrowed. Besides, you have insurance, a nice house, retirement accounts, all going to waste on you and Richard when I could use it now. The callousness of his statement stunned me into momentary silence. When I found my voice again, I asked, have you always felt this way about me? Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a flash of the boy he once was. Not always, he admitted. But you changed after Dad died. Everything became about control. I was trying to protect you, I said. You were trying to replace him, Jeffrey snapped, making all the decisions, never letting me be independent. There was a kernel of truth in his accusation that pierced my heart. Had I been too controlling in my grief? Had my fear of losing Jeffrey, too, made me hold on too tightly? These were questions I would need to explore with my therapist, but they didn't justify what Jeffrey had done. That might explain resentment, I said carefully. It doesn't explain trying to kill me. He shrugged, any trace of vulnerability disappearing. It was nothing personal, just business. I recoiled at his words, finally seeing the depth of the void where his empathy should be. The prosecutor offered me input on your plea deal, I said. Interest sharpened his features. And I haven't decided yet. Mom, come on. You're not going to let them lock me up. You're my mother. Yes, I am your mother. And that's why this is so hard. I stood up steadier than when I'd arrived. I'll always love you, Jeffrey. But I don't think I can save you anymore. His expression darkened. If you let them put me away, we're done. You understand that you won't have a son anymore. The threat hung in the air between us. A month ago, it would have devastated me, sent me scrambling to placate him. Now I recognized it as another manipulation tactic. I think I lost my son long before today, I said quietly. Goodbye, Jeffrey. As I walked away, he called after me, his voice alternating between threats and pleas. I didn't look back. Outside the jail, I sat in my car and wept, not just for the son who had tried to kill me, but for the years I'd spent enabling behavior that had gradually destroyed him. For the first time, I understood that my help had actually been harmful. The legal process moved forward with methodical precision. The prosecutor called with updates on new evidence discovered. Jeffrey had researched other methods of killing me before settling on the freezer plan. He had already contacted real estate agents about selling my house after his mother's unexpected passing. The district attorney offered a plea deal. Jeffrey would plead guilty to attempted murder and fraud charges in exchange for a 20-year sentence instead of the potential life imprisonment a trial might bring. Mrs. Matthews, the prosecutor explained, you have considerable influence here. If you prefer, we seek the maximum penalty we can take this to trial. If you support the plea offer, that carries weight too. I consulted with victim advocates, with Richard, with my therapist. I prayed for guidance. In the end, I decided to support the plea deal with one additional condition: mandatory psychiatric treatment throughout his incarceration. 20 years is a long time, Richard said when I told him my decision. Are you sure? No, I admitted. But it's enough time to protect society while giving him a chance for treatment and eventual release. He'll still be relatively young when he gets out. And if he tries to contact you after his release? I thought carefully before answering. That will depend on whether he's gotten help and taken responsibility for his actions. I won't enable him again, but I won't close the door forever either. Jeffrey's lawyer presented him with the offer. Initially, he refused, convinced he could charm a jury into acquittal. But as the evidence against him mounted, and his lawyer explained the likelihood of a much longer sentence after trial, he reluctantly agreed to the terms. On the day of his plea hearing, I sat in the courtroom, Richard beside me for support. Jeffrey avoided my gaze as he entered his guilty plea, answering the judge's questions in a flat, emotionless voice. When asked if he wished to address the court before sentencing, he declined. The judge then turned to me. Mrs. Matthews, as the victim in this case, you have the right to make a statement if you wish. I hadn't planned to speak, but something compelled me to stand. The courtroom fell silent as I approached the podium. Your Honor, I come before you not just as a victim, but as a mother. The person who tried to murder me is my son, whom I raised and loved with all my heart. That makes this crime doubly painful, a violation of both personal safety and maternal trust. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Jeffrey still wouldn't look at me. I've spent years trying to help my son overcome his demons, but I now understand that my help became enabling, and my enabling became destructive. To him, and ultimately to me. I support this sentence not out of vengeance, but out of hope that with proper treatment, Jeffrey might one day understand the gravity of his actions and find a path to redemption. I turned slightly to address my son directly. Jeffrey, I forgive you not to absolve you of responsibility, but to free myself from the burden of hatred. I hope you use this time to heal the broken places inside you. As I returned to my seat, Jeffrey finally looked up, his expression unreadable. The judge thanked me for my statement, then formally sentenced Jeffrey to 20 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment. As the bailiff led him away, Jeffrey looked back over his shoulder, not at me, but at the freedom he was leaving behind. I wondered if he was capable of understanding the gift hidden within his punishment, the opportunity to finally confront his true self. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in years, as though I'd put down a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Richard squeezed my hand. Are you okay? He asked gently. No, I answered honestly. But I think I will be. The months following Jeffrey's sentencing were a time of profound healing and transformation. Richard and I decided to sell our house. Neither of us could bear to return to the place where I had nearly died. We purchased a smaller home in a different neighborhood, a fresh start, symbolizing our new beginning. Initially, the trauma of the freezer incident haunted me. I would wake in the night shivering, despite the warm blankets, convinced I was back in that cold, dark place. My therapist diagnosed PTSD and worked with me through exposure therapy and cognitive techniques to process the trauma. Recovery isn't linear, she reminded me when I grew frustrated with nightmares that persisted. Give yourself grace for the difficult days. Slowly, the acute symptoms began to fade. I still avoided cold storage areas and kept our new home almost uncomfortably warm, but the paralyzing fear subsided. More difficult was processing my role in Jeffrey's development. I enabled him, I admitted during one particularly difficult therapy session. I saw the warning signs for years and ignored them because it was easier than facing the truth. That doesn't make you responsible for his choices, my therapist countered. Understanding your part in the dynamic is important, but he made his own decisions. Richard and I attended counseling together as well, rebuilding our relationship on stronger, more honest foundations. He had been right about Jeffrey all along, but never once said, "I told you so." Instead, he supported my healing process with patience and compassion. "I should have protected you better," he said one evening as we sat on our new porch. "I knew something was wrong with Jeffrey." "We both made mistakes," I replied, taking his hand. "But we're here now, together." Our marriage grew stronger through the ordeal, our communication more direct and honest. We established healthier boundaries with everyone in our lives, learning to balance compassion with self-protection. 3 months after Jeffrey's sentencing, I received a letter from another mother whose son was in prison for similar crimes. She had read about our case in the newspaper and reached out, understanding my pain in a way few others could. "How do you reconcile loving someone who tried to destroy you?" she asked. That question led me to a support group for parents of adult children with criminal convictions. Sitting in a circle with others who understood the complicated grief of loving someone who had caused grave harm was profoundly healing. I was not alone in my conflicted emotions. Margaret, a woman whose daughter had embezzled her life savings, became a particular friend and ally. "We can love them without excusing their actions," she told me. "And we can set boundaries without abandoning them." Those words became my mantra as I navigated my new relationship with Jeffrey. Initially, I didn't contact him in prison, needing space to heal and establish my own identity, separate from his needs and manipulations. When I finally did write 6 months into his sentence, my letter was kind but firm. "I will always love you as my son," I wrote, "but my love will no longer take the form of enabling destructive behavior. I forgive you for what happened, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or placing myself in harm's way again." Jeffrey's response when it came was predictable. A mixture of charm, subtle guilt-tripping, and requests for money for his commissary account. I recognized the manipulation tactics that once would have worked on me and responded with gentle boundaries. "I'm glad to hear from you," I wrote back, "but I won't be sending money. Instead, I encourage you to participate fully in the treatment programs available to you." Over time, our correspondence developed a rhythm. I would write about my life, share family news, and always encourage his participation in therapy. He would alternate between sincere-seeming engagement and attempts to manipulate. I learned to respond to the former and kindly ignore the latter. A year after the incident, I was invited to speak at a conference for families affected by addiction and criminal behavior. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected my own journey, I shared the hardest lessons I'd learned. "Loving someone doesn't mean saving them from consequences," I told the audience. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back and allow natural outcomes to occur. This isn't abandonment. It's recognition that some journeys must be walked alone." After my talk, dozens of parents approached me, many in tears, to share their own stories of loving children who had caused them harm. Their gratitude for my candor was healing in itself, transforming my pain into something useful. Richard watched from the back of the room, his eyes shining with pride. Later, he confessed, "When I first met you, I admired your compassion. Now I admire your strength even more." That strength was tested when Jeffrey's prison psychiatrist contacted me requesting a family therapy session. Jeffrey had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits conditions that explained much of his behavior, but offered little hope for fundamental change. "Should I even go?" I asked my therapist. "Can someone with his diagnosis truly benefit from family therapy?" "The prognosis is challenging," she acknowledged. "But your participation isn't just for him. It's also part of your healing process, a chance to speak your truth in a controlled environment." The session, conducted via video conference, was difficult but important. Jeffrey appeared thin and subdued, the prison environment having stripped away his usual charm. With the therapist mediating, I was able to express the pain his actions had caused without being manipulated or interrupted. I spoke of my love for him, my regret for the ways I had enabled rather than helped, and my hope that he might find a way to build a meaningful life despite his circumstances. Jeffrey's response was a mixture of genuine reflection and practiced manipulation. But for brief moments, I caught glimpses of authentic remorse. "I didn't see you as a person," he admitted in one such moment. "Just an obstacle or resource. I don't know why I'm like this." Those glimpses weren't enough to rebuild trust, but they offered a fragile hope that somewhere within him existed the capacity for change, however limited. As the second year of Jeffrey's sentence began, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would visit him in person. The prison psychiatrist supported this step, believing it might help Jeffrey's treatment process. The visit was nothing like our first confrontation after his arrest. This time I arrived centered and prepared my boundaries firmly in place. Jeffrey, too, seemed different, less confident, more reflective. "I've been thinking about what you said about enabling," he told me, "about how your help actually hurt me in the long run." "And what conclusions have you reached?" I asked cautiously. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "But I'm starting to see patterns, ways I've always manipulated people. It's uncomfortable to look at." It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was something. A small crack in the facade that had allowed him to justify his actions for so long. I left the visit feeling cautiously optimistic, though I maintained realistic expectations about the limitations of his diagnosis. Back home, I continued rebuilding my life. Richard and I traveled, something we'd put off during the years of crisis with Jeffrey. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected, volunteered at a women's shelter, and eventually began mentoring other parents navigating similar situations with their adult children. The freezing darkness of the walk-in freezer gradually receded in my consciousness, becoming a chapter in my story, rather than its defining moment. I still carried physical reminders: 2 fingertips that remained sensitive to cold, a slight limp from frostbite damage. But these served as testaments to survival rather than victimhood. When people asked how I could possibly forgive a son who tried to kill me, I would explain the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness was something I did for myself, not for him, I would say. It meant releasing the corrosive anger that would have destroyed me from within. Reconciliation, however, depends on genuine change and trustworthiness, which may never be possible. And that's okay. That understanding, that it was okay to love Jeffrey from a distance, to wish him well while protecting myself, was perhaps the most healing realization of all. It freed me from the impossible burden of trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, and allowed me to reclaim my life as my own. 3 years into Jeffrey's sentence, I received a letter unlike any previous communication. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was markedly different. Reflective rather than manipulative, accepting responsibility without excuses. "I understand now that I may never be able to fully repair the damage I've caused," he wrote. "But I'm committed to the treatment process, not because it might shorten my sentence, but because I don't want to be the person I was anymore." Whether this represented genuine growth or another more sophisticated manipulation, I couldn't know with certainty. But I chose to acknowledge the effort while maintaining appropriate boundaries. "I'm proud of the work you're doing," I wrote back. Real change happens one day at a time, one choice at a time. I'm here to support your healthy choices even from a distance. As I sealed the envelope, I realized how far I'd come from the woman who once would have done anything, risked everything to keep her son happy. That woman had nearly died in a freezer. The woman I had become understood that true love sometimes means letting go. Richard found me sitting quietly after mailing the letter. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, sitting beside me. "I was just thinking about fate," I replied. "Jeffrey thought he was deciding mine when he locked me in that freezer, but in the end, I was the one who decided his, and my own." Richard nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions behind my words. "You chose justice with compassion. That's no small thing." "And I chose life," I added. "My life. On my terms." As the sun set outside our window, I felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. The journey from victim to survivor to thriver had been arduous, but standing on the other side, I knew with certainty that while Jeffrey had locked me in a freezer, I was the one who had ultimately found the key, not just to that door, but to my own freedom. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision that involved someone you loved? How did you find the strength to do what was necessary? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of survival and transformation. Remember, sometimes the most loving choice is also the hardest one. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the courage to choose your own path forward.